The sound wasn't just a slap. It was a crack of thunder that silenced a room full of 50 people instantly. In the middle of the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, a corrupt bailiff had just backhanded a black woman across the face for speaking out of turn during a hearing on March 15, 2025. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just slowly adjusted her glasses, tasted the blood pooling on her lip, and looked at the man with eyes that could freeze hell over. They thought she was nobody. They thought she was just another case number to be crushed under the weight of a system designed to protect the powerful. But they didn't know that the woman standing in handcuffs was actually Chief Justice Margaret Chen of the California Supreme Court, conducting an undercover federal audit of the most corrupt courthouse in the state. What happened next wasn't justice. It was a systematic execution of their careers, their fortunes, and their freedom. The air conditioning in Superior Court Division 47 had been broken for 5 days, or so they claimed. The temperature inside courtroom hovered somewhere near 90 degrees. The heat was suffocating, a thick, humid blanket that smelled of nervous sweat, burnt coffee from the vending machine down the hall, and the lemon-scented floor wax the janitors used every Tuesday. Margaret Chen sat in the back row of the public gallery, fanning herself with a folded court schedule she'd picked up at the entrance. She wore a simple, slightly wrinkled charcoal pantsuit from Target and scuffed black loafers that looked like they'd walked through 1,000 parking lots. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a messy bun secured with a cheap plastic clip, and she clutched a worn leather handbag that had seen better decades. The bag's strap was frayed, held together in one spot with duct tape. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like an exhausted grandmother, perhaps there to support a troubled grandson facing drug charges, or maybe pleading for an extension on an eviction notice in the housing court next door. She made herself small, invisible, blending into the wood-paneled scenery like wallpaper. But her eyes, sharp, dark, intelligent, missed nothing. They tracked every movement. The court clerk typing lazily on her iPhone instead of the official computer. The bailiff cracking his knuckles while staring down a terrified teenager in an orange jumpsuit. The prosecutor checking his fantasy football scores. Order. I said order in this court. The voice boomed from the bench with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Judge Marcus Holloway didn't look like a man interested in justice. He looked like a man interested in his tea time. He was red-faced, sweating profusely through his black robes, and held his gavel like Thor's hammer, a weapon to crush rather than a tool to guide. Judge Holloway was notorious throughout Los Angeles County. Defense attorneys whispered about him in the hallways. Public defenders drew straws to avoid his courtroom. If you were wealthy and connected, he was your benevolent uncle, dispensing probation and community service like Halloween candy. If you were poor, black, brown, or just unlucky enough to land on his docket without expensive representation, he was a waking nightmare wrapped in judicial immunity. Mr. Rodriguez, Holloway sneered, looking down at a young public defender who appeared to be running on 3 hours of sleep and gas station coffee. Your client is wasting the court's valuable time. The window tint on his vehicle was illegal. The search of his trunk was therefore valid. Your motion to suppress the evidence is denied. Next case. But Your Honor, the young attorney stammered, his voice cracking with exhaustion and desperation. There was no probable cause for the initial traffic stop. My client was simply driving through his own neighborhood. I said next case. Holloway slammed the gavel down so hard that a glass of water on his desk sloshed over the rim, creating a small puddle that nobody dared to clean up. One more word out of you, Rodriguez, and I'll hold you in contempt. 30 days in county will teach you some respect for this court's rulings. Bailiff, get him out of my sight. Margaret watched as the young public defender was escorted toward the side door, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his client, a 19-year-old Latino kid, being led away in chains for possession of a small amount of marijuana that would have been legal to possess just 2 miles away in a different jurisdiction. She pulled a small, battered notebook from her handbag, the kind journalists used in the 1970s, and with a dull pencil, scribbled a single line in her precise handwriting. Judge Holloway, dismissal of constitutional due process. Case hashtag 2025, CR 4047. March 15, 2025, 10:47 a.m. She wasn't there for a nephew. She wasn't there for an eviction hearing. She wasn't even there as a spectator. Not really. Chief Justice Margaret Chen was there because she had heard rumors, persistent, disturbing whispers in the California legal community that Division 47 had become a kingdom of corruption, ruled by a judge who believed he was untouchable and enforced by a bailiff who acted like his personal executioner. For 6 months, the California Judicial Commission had received complaints, anonymous letters, desperate phone calls from defendants who'd been railroaded, tearful testimony from families who'd watched their loved ones sentenced to years in prison for crimes that wealthy defendants walked away from with warning. Traditional oversight had failed. Formal complaints disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Internal affairs investigations were stonewalled by a tight network of corrupt officials who protected each other like a mob family. So Margaret had volunteered for something unprecedented, an undercover federal audit, authorized by the U.S. Department of Justice, to document the corruption firsthand. For 2 weeks, she'd attended court sessions, taken notes, recorded conversations in the hallway. She'd watched the machinery of injustice grind innocent people into dust. Today, she would reveal herself. Today, the hammer would fall. But first, she needed one more piece of evidence. One undeniable act of corruption so blatant that even the most skeptical appeals court would be forced to act. Next case, the clerk called out, her voice bored and monotone. The People versus Victoria Ashford. The courtroom doors swung open, and Margaret's patience would soon be rewarded. The atmosphere in Division 47 shifted the moment she entered. It was as if someone had opened a window in the suffocating courtroom and let in a breeze. Except the breeze smelled of expensive perfume and entitlement. Victoria Ashford was 23 years old and looked like she was heading to a charity gala rather than a criminal arraignment. She wore a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than the bailiff's monthly salary, Jimmy Choo heels that clicked authoritatively against the linoleum floor, and carried a Hermes Birkin bag in a shade of pink that didn't exist in nature. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect beach waves, and her makeup was flawless despite the oppressive heat. She didn't look worried. She didn't look remorseful. She looked mildly inconvenienced, like someone had asked her to attend a boring conference call. Victoria walked past Margaret's row, leaving a trail of expensive fragrance. Notes of jasmine and bergamot that briefly masked the smell of desperation that usually hung over Division 47 like smog. She didn't sit at the defendant's table. Instead, she leaned against it casually, examining her manicured nails with the detached interest of someone inspecting a restaurant menu she'd already decided was beneath her standards. Miss Ashford. Judge Holloway's entire demeanor transformed. The sneer vanished, replaced by a sycophantic warmth that made Margaret's stomach turn. His voice became gentle, almost fatherly. So good to see you again. I trust your father is well. Still planning that development project in Malibu. He's wonderful, Marcus, Victoria said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. She didn't call him Your Honor. She didn't call him Judge Holloway. She called him Marcus, as if they were old friends meeting for brunch. A ripple of shock went through the gallery. Several people in the back rows exchanged glances. The court clerk looked up from her phone, eyebrows raised. Even the prosecutor, a tired-looking woman named Elena Santos, seemed taken aback by the casual breach of courtroom protocol. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her pen poised above her notebook. This was it. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. Now then, Judge Holloway cleared his throat, shuffling some papers on his desk with exaggerated casualness. I see here you've been charged with felony DUI, reckless endangerment, destruction of public property, and assault on a peace officer. Quite serious charges. Margaret knew the details of this case. She'd read the police report the night before, sitting in her modest hotel room 3 blocks from the courthouse. Victoria Ashford had crashed her Porsche 911 Carrera into a Metro bus stop at 2:30 in the morning on February 28, 2025. Her blood alcohol content was 0.18, more than twice the legal limit. The bus stop she destroyed had been occupied at the time. A 62-year-old janitor named Luis Mendoza had sustained a broken leg and 3 fractured ribs diving out of the way. When police arrived, Victoria had been belligerent, screaming about her father's connections. She'd allegedly spit in the face of the arresting officer, a rookie named Officer Jennifer Park, and tried to bribe her with a handful of $100 bills pulled from her Birkin bag. It was a slam-dunk felony case. Multiple witnesses, body camera footage, toxicology reports, victim testimony. Any competent prosecutor could secure a conviction in their sleep. Victoria's attorney stood up. His name was Franklin Cross, a slick defense lawyer in a $10,000 suit who specialized in making wealthy people's problems disappear. He smiled at Judge Holloway like they shared a private joke. "Your Honor," Cross began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "my client pleads not guilty to all charges. Furthermore, we move for immediate dismissal based on emotional distress and diminished capacity. Miss Ashford has been under considerable psychological duress due to her extensive charitable work with underprivileged communities. The stress of giving back to society has taken a severe toll on her mental health." Margaret's pen froze over her notebook. Charitable work. She'd researched Victoria Ashford extensively. The young woman's social media was public. Thousands of photos of yacht parties in Monaco, shopping trips to Paris, bottle service at exclusive Los Angeles nightclubs. There wasn't a single photograph of her at a soup kitchen or homeless shelter. The only charity Victoria seemed to support was the luxury goods industry. Of course, Judge Holloway nodded sympathetically, as if Cross had just explained quantum physics. "We can't have our community leaders suffering from the burden of their generosity." "I'm inclined to agree with your assessment, Counselor. The city can rebuild a bus stop. We cannot rebuild a broken spirit dedicated to helping others." Elena Santos, the prosecutor, finally found her voice. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The defendant nearly killed a man. We have video evidence of." "The prosecution's objections are noted and overruled," Holloway interrupted, not even looking at Santos. He raised his gavel. "Charges dismissed with prejudice. Miss Ashford, you are free to go. Please give my regards to your father. Tell him I'm still interested in that investment opportunity he mentioned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was so corrupt, so blatantly wrong, so nakedly transactional that for a moment, nobody in the courtroom could breathe. The young public defender who'd been threatened with contempt earlier stood near the side door, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. The families in the gallery, mostly black and brown faces who'd watched their sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters get sentenced to years in prison for minor drug offenses, stared in stunned horror. And then a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Margaret Chen stood up. "Objection," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. She didn't shout, but it possessed a peculiar carrying quality. The voice of someone accustomed to being heard. The voice of someone who'd spent 30 years commanding courtrooms. It cut through the hum of the broken air conditioning system like a surgical blade. Judge Holloway froze, his gavel still touching the striking block. He blinked, looking around the courtroom as if he couldn't believe someone had actually spoken. His eyes landed on the back row, on the disheveled black woman in the cheap gray suit. "Excuse me." Holloway's voice took on a dangerous edge. "Who the hell said that?" "I did," Margaret said, stepping out into the center aisle. She walked with a slow, deliberate gait, clutching her worn handbag with both hands. "I object to this dismissal, Your Honor. You haven't even reviewed the victim impact statement or the toxicology report." Victoria Ashford spun around, her perfect eyebrows arching in disgust. "Who is this old hag? Marcus, make her stop talking. She's ruining my day." The battle was about to begin. "You," Judge Holloway pointed a shaking finger at Margaret, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple that suggested dangerously high blood pressure. "Sit down right now. This is not a town hall meeting. You are a spectator. You have no standing in this court." Margaret continued her slow walk down the center aisle, her worn loafers making soft sounds against the linoleum. She didn't hurry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply continued speaking in that calm, measured tone that defense attorneys across California had learned to respect over 3 decades. "I have standing as a citizen of the state of California who expects the law to be applied equally," Margaret replied. Section 170.1 of the California Code of Civil Procedure requires a judge to recuse themselves when they have a personal or financial relationship with a defendant. You just allowed Miss Ashford to call you Marcus in open court. You referenced an investment opportunity. This court has been compromised. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Someone in the back row whispered, "Oh shit." The bailiff pushed off from the wall where he'd been leaning. His name was Officer Derek Kowalski, and he was a massive man, 6'5", 260 pounds of steroid-enhanced muscle packed into a tan uniform that seemed perpetually on the verge of tearing at the seams. He had a buzz cut, a thick neck that looked like a tree trunk, and a reputation among the inmates in the holding cells for accidents that left detainees with broken ribs and black eyes. Kowalski hooked his thumbs into his utility belt and began stalking toward Margaret with the predatory gait of someone who enjoyed hurting people. "Lady," he grunted, his voice like gravel sliding down a metal chute. "The judge told you to sit your ass down. Last warning." Margaret didn't look at him. She kept her eyes locked on Judge Holloway, her gaze unwavering. Furthermore, dismissing multiple felony charges without prejudice, based on unsubstantiated claims of emotional distress from charitable activities, violates established legal precedent. "This isn't judicial discretion, Your Honor. This is judicial misconduct. This is, by definition, malfeasance." "Malfeasance?" Holloway's voice cracked like a whip. Spit flew from his lips as he half rose from his chair. "You dare walk into my courtroom, looking like that, and lecture me about the law? Who the hell do you think you are?" "The law doesn't care what I look like, Judge Holloway," Margaret said, stopping 10 feet from the bench. Her voice remained preternaturally calm, a still pond before a tsunami. "It cares about facts. And the fact is, you are erasing a serious crime because the defendant's father finances your lifestyle. How much did he pay you to make this disappear?" "Get her out," Holloway screamed, his face now approaching burgundy. "Kowalski, remove this woman. Contempt of court. 60 days in county jail. Get her out of my sight." Victoria Ashford let out a cruel, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Bye-bye, Grandma. Don't forget to take your meds in jail." She pulled out her iPhone and started recording, clearly planning to post Margaret's arrest on her social media for her 500,000 followers. Kowalski moved with surprising speed for such a large man. He closed the distance in 3 strides and grabbed Margaret by the upper arm. His grip was immediately bruising, his thick fingers digging into her bicep with unnecessary, punishing force. The kind of grip designed to leave marks, to send a message. "You heard the judge," Kowalski sneered, leaning down so his hot, coffee-stale breath hit Margaret's face. "Let's go, sweetheart. Time for you to learn to keep your mouth shut when your betters are talking." Margaret looked down at the hand gripping her arm. Then she raised her eyes slowly to meet Kowalski's gaze. Her voice dropped an octave, becoming colder than liquid nitrogen. "Remove your hand from me, officer. I will not ask you twice." Kowalski laughed, a wet, ugly sound that held years of accumulated cruelty. "Or what? You gonna hit me with your purse? You gonna call your social worker?" He yanked her arm hard, trying to spin her around toward the exit. "Old bitch needs to learn her place." Margaret stumbled but caught her footing. She didn't resist his pull, but she didn't move voluntarily either. She planted her feet, becoming an immovable object through sheer force of will. "I am warning you," Margaret said, her eyes narrowing to dark slits. "You are making a mistake that will cost you everything you have." "The only mistake made here," Kowalski spat, "was your mother not swallowing you." The courtroom gasped. Even Franklin Cross, Victoria's sleazy attorney, looked uncomfortable. That was over the line, even by Division 47's degraded standards. And then, fueled by adrenaline, the implicit approval of Judge Holloway, and the cheers he imagined he'd receive from his fellow corrupt officers, Kowalski did the unthinkable. He didn't just pull her toward the exit. He raised his free hand, a slab of meat made heavier by his college class ring and his Masonic Lodge ring, and swung it in a wide arc. Crack! The sound of his open palm striking Margaret's face was like a gunshot in the enclosed space. It was the sound of flesh hitting flesh with bone-jarring force, amplified by the acoustics of the wood-paneled room. The impact was so violent that Margaret's head snapped to the side, her neck twisting at a dangerous angle. Her glasses, cheap readers from CVS Pharmacy, flew off her face, skittering across the linoleum floor until they hit the leg of the defense table with a small tink of breaking plastic. A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen out of the room. Even Victoria Ashford stopped recording, her mouth hanging open in shock. Elena Santos, the prosecutor, stood frozen with her hand halfway to her mouth. The families in the gallery sat like statues, eyes wide with horror. For exactly 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. The air conditioning hummed. Someone's phone vibrated, the sound obscenely loud in the quiet. Margaret stood there, her head turned to the right, blood beginning to well at the corner of her lip, a bright crimson drop against her dark skin. Her cheek was already swelling, the impact raising an immediate welt that would become a spectacular bruise within the hour. "There!" Kowalski panted, lowering his hand and flexing his fingers. He looked slightly wild-eyed, the adrenaline making him jittery. Maybe that'll teach you some goddamn respect. Judge Holloway sat back in his chair, a smug grin returning to his florid face. Excellent work, Officer Kowalski. Put her in holding cell 3. We'll deal with her formal arraignment after my lunch break. I'm thinking Italian today. Margaret slowly, so slowly it seemed like time had become syrup, turned her head back to center. She didn't reach up to touch her burning cheek. She didn't reach down to retrieve her broken glasses. Instead, she reached into her battered handbag. Gun! Victoria shrieked, diving under the defense table in her cream-colored dress and designer heels. She has a gun. Shoot her. Kowalski's hand flew to his taser, fingers fumbling with the safety strap, but he was too slow, his brain still clouded by adrenaline and the sick satisfaction of having struck someone helpless. But Margaret didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a wallet. It was a sleek black leather bifold with a gold emblem embossed on the front, the seal of the state of California. She flipped it open with a practiced snap of her wrist and held it high in the air, her arm perfectly steady despite having just been struck. The overhead fluorescent lights caught the gold badge pinned inside, making it gleam like a small sun. It wasn't a police badge. It wasn't a lawyer's bar card. It wasn't a social worker's identification. It was a Federal Judicial Commission badge, inlaid with the seal of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court Oversight Committee. Below the badge, laminated and official, was an ID card with Margaret's photo and her title. I am Chief Justice Margaret Chen of the California Supreme Court, she announced. Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the room. It was the voice of God handing down commandments. And I am currently conducting a federal judicial audit of Division 47 under the authority of the United States Department of Justice. The color drained from Judge Holloway's face so quickly that he looked like he was decomposing in real time. His mouth worked soundlessly, opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. He tried to stand up, but his knees gave out completely, and he collapsed back into his leather chair, which squeaked obscenely in the silence. Kowalski stared at the badge. His brain, trained for years to recognize authority, finally processed what he was seeing. The grandma he'd just backhanded across the face was the highest-ranking judge in California. She was his boss's 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 boss. She had the power to end his career with a single phone call. She had the power to put him in prison. Oh, Kowalski whispered, all the blood draining from his face. Oh fuck. Oh Jesus fuck. Officer Derek Kowalski, Margaret said, wiping the blood from her lip with her thumb and looking at it with clinical interest. You are under arrest for assault on a federal judicial official, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. She turned her gaze to the bench, pointing a finger at the trembling judge. Her eyes had become something ancient and terrible. The eyes of justice herself, finally awakened and righteously furious. And you, Margaret said, get out of my chair. The hammer had fallen. Your Honor, I mean Chief Justice, I didn't know. Judge Holloway stammered, his hands shaking so violently that he knocked over his water glass. It tumbled off the desk and shattered on the floor behind the bench with a crash that made everyone jump. It was a misunderstanding. The heat, the stress. I wasn't thinking clearly. I said. Margaret's voice cut through his babbling like a blade. Get out of my chair. Holloway scrambled to obey. He tripped over his own robes in his haste to vacate the bench, nearly falling off the raised platform. He caught himself on the armrest at the last second, then stumbled down the 3 stairs to stand off to the side, looking small and pathetic in his disheveled judicial robes. The man who'd terrorized thousands of defendants over the past 8 years now looked like a scared child caught stealing cookies. Margaret Chen didn't take the stairs. She stepped directly up onto the platform with a grace that belied her 62 years and walked behind the high desk. She stood there for a moment, surveying the courtroom with eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Victoria Ashford, still crouched under the defense table in her designer dress. She looked at Kowalski, who stood frozen like a statue, sweat now pouring down his face. She looked at the young public defender whose case had been dismissed earlier, his eyes wide with disbelief. She looked at the families in the gallery, black faces, brown faces, poor faces, all staring at her with expressions that mixed hope and shock in equal measure. She picked up the gavel. It felt right in her hand, balanced and true. This was where she belonged. Bailiff Ramirez, Margaret called out to the other court officer, a young Latina woman named Officer Sofia Ramirez, who stood in the corner looking terrified, but Margaret's research had indicated morally clean. Please arrest Officer Kowalski. Use his own handcuffs. Yes, Your Honor. Mum. Chief Justice, Sofia stammered, moving immediately. She approached Kowalski with visible nervousness. He was her training officer, her superior. But she pulled his arms behind his back with shaking hands. The sound of the handcuffs clicking onto Kowalski's thick wrists was the sweetest sound Division 47 had heard in years. Each click echoed through the silent courtroom like a bell tolling justice. You have the right to remain silent, Sofia began, her voice gaining strength with each word. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. And now, Margaret said, her eyes locking onto Victoria Ashford, who was slowly crawling out from under the table, her perfect hair now disheveled, her makeup smudged. Let's revisit the case of the People versus Victoria Ashford. I believe the previous judge made a serious error. The charges are hereby reinstated. You can't do this. Victoria's voice had lost its bored, entitled tone. Now it was shrill with panic. My father is Richard Ashford. He owns half of Los Angeles. He plays golf with the mayor and the governor. When he hears about this, you'll be. Your father, Margaret interrupted calmly, is currently under federal investigation for bribing city inspectors, laundering money through shell companies, and tax evasion. The FBI raided his offices this morning at 6 a.m. I suggest you focus on your own legal troubles, Miss Ashford, because your father won't be available to bail you out. He's rather busy with his own 7 federal charges. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Victoria's face went chalk white. Franklin Cross, her attorney, began backing toward the exit. He was a survivor, a rat sensing the ship sinking beneath his feet. Your Honor, Chief Justice, I need to consult with my client privately. Perhaps we could. You're going nowhere, Mr. Cross, Margaret said sharply. Officer Ramirez, please secure the courtroom doors. Nobody enters. Nobody leaves until the U.S. Marshals arrive. U.S. Marshals? Cross squeaked, his smooth courtroom voice cracking. Surely that's not necessary. It's absolutely necessary, Margaret replied. Because this isn't just about one corrupt judge and one entitled defendant. This is about a systematic pattern of corruption that has infected this entire courthouse like a cancer. And today, we're beginning the operation to cut it out. She opened a drawer in the judge's desk, Holloway's personal drawer, and began removing items. A bottle of expensive scotch, a box of Cuban cigars, a burner phone, and then, tucked in the back, a small black leather ledger. Margaret held up the ledger, and Judge Holloway made a sound like a wounded animal. No, he whispered. No, that's privileged, attorney-client, you can't. This, Margaret said, opening the book, is a detailed record of bribes, payoffs, and case-fixing going back 5 years. Every entry is in your handwriting, Judge Holloway. March 3, 2025, DUI dismissal, v. Ashford, payment received $8,000. February 15, 2025. Possession with intent to sell, reduced to misdemeanor, defendant J. Morrison, son of city councilman, payment received $12,000. January 28, 2025. Eviction fast track, Ashford Development Corporation, payment received $5,000. She looked up from the ledger, her eyes hard. You documented your own crimes, Marcus. You wrote down every bribe you took, every case you fixed, every life you destroyed for money. Why? Holloway's face crumpled. Insurance, he whispered. If they ever came after me, I could take everyone else down with me. The police captains, the prosecutors, the other judges. Everyone was in on it. I wasn't going down alone. Well, Margaret said, closing the ledger with a heavy thud. You were right about one thing. You're not going down alone. The courtroom doors burst open. 6 U.S. Marshals in tactical vests stormed in, moving with military precision. Leading them was Deputy Marshal Thomas Blake, a man Margaret had worked with for 15 years. He was built like a linebacker and had a face carved from granite. He walked straight to the bench, looked at Margaret's swollen face, and his expression darkened dangerously. Who hit you? Blake asked, his voice low and lethal. He's already in custody, Margaret said, gesturing to Kowalski. We have bigger problems, Tom. I need you to secure Judge Holloway's chambers. All files, all computers, all hard drives. There's a safe behind the diploma on the east wall. Get into it. On it. Blake signaled to his team. As the marshals moved toward the judge's private chambers, Holloway finally broke. "You can't do this. That's private property. I have rights." "You had rights," Margaret corrected him coldly. "You had the right to dispense justice fairly. You had the right to uphold the Constitution you swore to defend. Instead, you sold your office to the highest bidder. Now you're just another defendant, and you'll receive exactly the same justice you gave to those poor kids you sent to prison for minor drug offenses." She turned to Officer Ramirez. "Take Mr. Holloway into custody. Charges are judicial corruption, racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. And Miss Ashford, given your family's private jet and clear flight risk, bail is denied. You'll be held in county lockup until trial." "No!" Victoria screamed as Officer Ramirez approached with handcuffs. "Don't touch me. Do you know how much this dress cost? I have a spa appointment tomorrow. You can't put me in jail." But the cuffs went on anyway. The clicking sound was becoming a familiar rhythm in Division 47. The sound of justice, delayed but finally arriving. As Victoria was led away screaming and Judge Holloway was cuffed and read his rights, the families in the gallery began to applaud. It started slow, one person clapping, then another, building into a thunderous ovation that shook the walls. Margaret raised her hand for silence. The applause died down. "We're not finished," she announced. "This corruption goes deeper than one judge and one defendant. We're going to review every case heard in this courtroom for the past 5 years. Every wrongful conviction. Every illegal sentence. Every life that was destroyed by this man's greed. Officer Ramirez, please bring up the first case file from the holding cells." The work had only just begun. But for the first time in years, the people of Division 47 had reason to hope. Justice had finally arrived. Deputy Marshal Thomas Blake walked out of Judge Holloway's office carrying an open safe. His face was tight with anger. Behind him, 2 other marshals carried evidence bags filled with laptops, documents, and stacks of $100 bills. "Chief Justice," Blake said, setting the safe on the table. "You need to see this." Margaret Chen stepped down from the bench. Inside the safe was about $40,000 in cash, 3 burner phones, and a thick leather notebook with gold edges. She opened it carefully with gloved hands. As she read, her expression hardened. This wasn't just one corrupt judge. It was an entire network. "April 12, 2024, she read aloud. "Meeting with Captain Rodriguez, LAPD. Discussed quotas for arrests. Agreed to raise drug charges in poor neighborhoods. Payment, $500 per conviction." The courtroom gasped. Margaret kept reading. June 8, 2024. Dinner with District Attorney Warren Pemberton and Judge Holloway. Agreed to fix cases for wealthy defendants. Dismissal fee, $15,000. "That's a lie," shouted a man near the door, District Attorney Pemberton himself. "Mr. Pemberton," Margaret said calmly, "anything you say will be used against you." "Marshal Blake, arrest him." He tried to run but was tackled and cuffed before reaching the exit. Margaret turned back to the ledger. It named judges, police captains, city council members, even 2 state senators. The corruption ran through the whole system. "Officer Ramirez," Margaret said, "call the FBI. Tell them we have a RICO case and need 20 agents and dozens of arrest warrants." Then she sat, exhausted but determined. "Bring me every file from Judge Holloway's cases," she ordered. "We're going to fix this." For 7 straight hours, Margaret reviewed cases. Each one revealed more injustice. Young people jailed for minor charges, families evicted illegally, veterans punished for being homeless. She overturned the wrongful convictions one by one, ordering releases and arrests for the officers who had lied. By evening, news crews were outside, but inside it was silent except for her steady voice. "Next case," she said. "The People versus Jamal Washington." A young man in an orange jumpsuit entered, eyes red from crying. Margaret read his file. An illegal search, an unfair trial. "Mr. Washington," she said softly, "your conviction is vacated. You are free to go." He fell to his knees, crying. His mother rushed to hug him as the courtroom erupted in applause. Margaret didn't smile. There was more work to do. "Next case," she said again. And the work continued. 6 months later. Snow fell outside the California Supreme Court in San Francisco. It was sentencing day. Inside, the courtroom was full, victims, reporters, and citizens waiting to see justice served. Margaret sat quietly in the front row, healed but still carrying the weight of everything she'd uncovered. 3 federal judges handled the sentencing. Judge Patricia Nakamura led the panel. The defendants entered, no longer powerful, just broken. Officer Derek Kowalski was thin and bruised. The guards he once commanded now guarded him. Judge Holloway looked pale and old. His arrogance was gone. Victoria and Richard Ashford, once rich and untouchable, now wore prison uniforms. Their empire had collapsed. And Franklin Cross, the slick lawyer, sat shaking, already disbarred and disgraced. Judge Nakamura began. "This court has seen corruption before," she said, "but never this deep, never this cruel." Officer Kowalski was first. "Following orders is not an excuse," Nakamura said. "You beat 27 people, and you attacked a federal judge. You'll serve 18 years at Pelican Bay." He screamed as marshals dragged him out. Next was Victoria Ashford. "You've lived your whole life taking from others," Nakamura said. "I can pay a fine," Victoria begged. "Your father has nothing left. You will serve 4 years cleaning highways and bus stops. Learn what work feels like." Then Richard Ashford. "You bought judges, ruined families, and destroyed lives," Nakamura said. "All your assets are seized for victim compensation. You'll serve 15 years in federal prison. Given your age, that's a life sentence." Finally, Judge Holloway stood. "There is no greater betrayal than a judge who sells justice," Nakamura said. "You turned your courtroom into an auction house." "I'm sorry," Holloway whispered, looking at Margaret. "Don't apologize to her," Nakamura snapped. "Apologize to the Constitution you broke. For your crimes, racketeering, bribery, and obstruction, you are sentenced to 28 years without parole. You'll serve your time in the same prison where you sent hundreds of poor defendants." The courtroom was silent. Then Nakamura's gavel fell. "You'll need luck, Mr. Holloway." As the room cleared, Margaret stayed seated, finally able to breathe. Carlos Rodriguez, the young public defender she'd once helped, approached her. "Thank you," he said. Margaret smiled. "We did this together. The system changes when good people stop staying silent." They walked out into the sunlight. The California justice system had changed. The corrupt network was gone. New laws required cameras in every courtroom and independent reviews. People now entered courtrooms with hope instead of fear. Margaret Chen wasn't a hero, just a judge who did her job. Outside, a young girl pointed at her car. "Mama, who's that lady?" Her mother smiled. "That's the woman who reminded everyone that no one is above the law." And that's how one act of courage exposed an empire of corruption and changed justice forever.